Today we have welcome to the distinguished colloquium jointly hosted by HDSI and TILOS and NSF AI Institute. If I got this right. So today we are thrilled to have invited Professor Max Winning from University of Amsterdam, who is a research chair in ML at the University of Amsterdam and was a distinguished scientist at Microsoft Research. He's also a fellow at the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, CIFAR, also at the European Lab for Learning and Intelligent Systems, previously a vice president of Colloquium. So he has numerous awards. I'll skip most of it, but some of it include, Max asked me to skip over those. So some of the awards include ECCV Codering Prize, as well as ICMO Test of Time Award, probably the highest accolade any paper can achieve. In terms of services, he's also directing Amsterdam Machine Learning Lab, co-directs Qualcomm UVA Deep Learning Lab, and Bosch UVA Deep Learning Lab. But without further ado, let's hear from Max.
Thank you very much, Ron. It's a huge pleasure to be here. Can everybody hear me well in the back as well? Okay, great. Actually, I'm now visiting Caltech for 2 months as a visiting professor, so that's why I'm in the neighborhood. Of course, I was also living in Irvine for 10 years, so I know the neighborhood. And in that time, I visited UCSD also a number of times, and I'm very happy to be back here. Yeah, I'm going to talk about something that is at the intersection between machine learning and deep learning and the natural sciences, something that I'm very excited about more recently, because I think machine learning can have a tremendous impact in the natural sciences, but also reversely, insights from the natural sciences, including neuroscience, but also physics and chemistry, can have an impact back in designing better machine learning algorithms. Oh, really?
Oh, I believe you muted yourself.
Oh, I thought I unmuted. Well, I am unmuted actually here. That's kind of strange. How can I be muted there?
Yeah.
So maybe this computer?
It's in there fine.
Yeah. A lot of people said they can
It's probably just one place.
Oh, fixed. Okay, good. All right. Well, thanks for mentioning it. Because I can't see that. In fact, that's not even on my computer. So let me go here. Right. Okay. Right. And so I'll give you examples of the cross-fertilization that's happening in both directions. No, it's not progressing. Does that work? Okay. And the sort of central, very simple equation that runs through this entire talk is the free energy. And the free energy turns out to play an important role, both in physics and chemistry, as you might know, but also in machine learning. And it stands for the two terms in the free energy, and energy and entropy. They stand for the Industrial Revolution in 1820, where human labor got replaced by machine labor, because energy is the term in the free energy with which you can do actual work on physical systems. And the entropy term is actually the missing information about a system. And that stands for the information revolution, or the AI revolution, in the midst you find yourself now. And what was Steve Jobs, who knew about free energies, which is already quite surprising, I would say. It says this revolution, the information revolution, is a revolution of free energy as well, but of another kind. He said it's free intellectual energy. And so where did that take us? Well, it took us to using these physics-based models, and I'll explain why this is actually a physics-based model, to create lots of beautiful images, and more recently, much beautiful videos. I think I didn't even put the Sora latest results in here, but now we can generate minutes-long videos, basically, which look pretty coherent. For those people who criticize it, but every time I see these things, I'm just blown away. I just think it's amazing that we can do these things now. And it's not hard to figure out where this will take us. We can just ask an AI to write us a nice movie script, and then ask some of these methods to just create a movie that follows that script, right? And maybe, who knows, maybe it's actually an entertaining movie at some point as well. That's not what I'm interested in, although I'm very impressed by all of that. I'm interested in the application of these techniques to the natural sciences. I think I've been working on, images and stuff like that for a long time. I think this application area is much nicer, and I hope to inspire the young people here that also take up maybe and test out your machine learning algorithms and your data science algorithms on this fantastic domain, application domain. So we can see here the one big success, which was protein folding, where you take an amino acids input sequence and you predict the three-dimensional structure of the resulting protein. Of course, protein structure is important for function. Down there is keeping a plasma stable inside a nuclear fusion reactor. That's a reinforcement learning problem, because you need to, you can keep it in the reactor and away from the boundaries of the reactor by controlling the magnetic fields, and the magnetic fields you can control with the reinforcement learning algorithm. And then that was some recent work that we did. Well, it's already not so recent anymore. Time goes fast, but this is generating molecules. So it's one of these models that generates images, now used to generate molecules. And of course, that's being used now and improved now, for instance, to design new drugs and materials. Okay, so some equations. It's for me a little hard to gauge what the actual audience is. Some of you want to hear stuff about, actual physics and maybe want to see some equations. Others don't. So I have something for all of you. So excuse me if it's too technical or too little technical. But this is certainly an equation. And so that's what we use in machine learning. It's called the evidence lower bound, and where X is the observed data. And minus log P of X is the minus log probability of the data. Now that thing is what you want to minimize, because the more likely your data becomes under your model, the better it's supposed to be. Now you can show that that's bounded by the expectation of the joint probability, log P, X, and Z, where Z are the microscopic degrees of freedom, which we call latent variables in our models, stochastic latent variables, that comprise our model, right? For instance, hidden factors that generate the actual data. And then we average that over a variational distribution QZ given X. And in order to actually bound it, we need to subtract this entropy of this distribution. Now, we can map this problem to a physics problem by thinking of X as things like volume or temperature, some of these macroscopic observables that we assign to a particular physics system. And Z we can assign to be the microscopic degrees of freedom, for instance, the positions of the molecules or something like that. And then in physics, you write down this free energy. The actual free energy is minus log partition function, which is the normalization constant of the Boltzmann distribution. And that's the equilibrium version of the free energy. But it's upper bounded by the variation of free energy, which also holds out of equilibrium, which is the expectation of the Hamiltonian, which is the function which computes the energy of the system, over a variational distribution Q minus temperature times the entropy. And now if you compare these two, you set T equals to 1, and you put X to be things like temperature and all these things, you find that they're actually equal. And so now you think, is that a coincidence, or is there something deeper going on? And then if you read, this is old work, of course, this guy was born in 57, this, dinosaur time, but he wrote really interesting papers about, this is a physicist, but he went into information theory. He's the inventor of the maximum entropy principle. You probably heard of that. And he wrote a bunch of papers about, how information theory and statistical mechanics relate to each other. And his view is really a Bayesian view of statistical mechanics, right? So if you think about entropy, many people think you can measure entropy, so that must be some physical property of the system. It must be an ontological property of the system. But he interpreted this as our degree of ignorance about the macroscopic degrees of freedom of a system. So entropy, like if you're an alien species and you can measure infinitely fast and infinitely precise, you will not have to deal with entropy. You will just see the state of the system. Now, that's exactly the reason why we have entropy and probabilities in machine learning. The only reason we have probabilities is because we don't keep track of all the degrees of freedom of the system. When we don't see certain things, we introduce probabilities over them. That's the Bayesian view of AI, if you wish. So that tells me there's a very deep connection between these two, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. Okay, so in AI for science, the application of machine learning and AI for science, so there is a huge spatial temporal scale spectrum of problems. So I just, had lunch with somebody who was doing, his work there in particle physics and using machine learning to improve detectors. And then I sometimes talk to somebody who does this work here in astrophysics, like trying to figure out, what is the shape of a galaxy if it gets lensed by a gravitational body like a black hole, and you see some kind of weird lensing effect. And in all of this, including all the intermediate scales, machine learning can be very fruitfully applied. And this goes from picometers and femtoseconds all the way to light years and gigayears. Now, I'm interested, not for any good reason in some sense, because all of these problems are super interesting. I'm interested in this intersection here, molecules. Molecules are living on the interface between quantum and classical. You can typically treat the atoms classically, but you need to treat the electrons quantum mechanically. And I will explain why this is such an exciting field right now. So everything in the world that you can touch around you is made of molecules. Now, there's a couple of exceptions, which is, of course, if you go to very high energies somewhere in a particle accelerator or somewhere deep in the universe, of course, molecules break up and they become plasmas or, quark gluon plasma or whatever, right? So there you might break things up and they cease to be molecules. And then there's also 4 known forces at this point, electromagnetic, gravity, and 2 nuclear forces that are not really described as molecules, but those are gauge fields. Everything else is made of molecules. So if you understand them better, you might have a higher control over the world. Here's a bunch of examples. Drug discovery, where you try to fit a particular small molecule, typically a ligand, inside the pocket of a protein in order to design a new drug. Or solar cells, where you try to capture or harvest sun or light into electricity. That's also a problem of materials. This is lubricants. 20% of all the energy is wasted due to friction in the world. So if you build better lubricants, you can reduce that. This is catalysts. These are surfaces on which chemical reactions are accelerated. And we need them, for instance, to do electrolysis, for instance, to split water into hydrogen and oxygen, but there's many other chemical reactions that we want to accelerate. For instance, the production of fertilizer, which is a very old and dirty process, which is called, the process is called nitrogen fixation. I think it's called the Haber-Bosch process right now. And then carbon capture, which is to get carbon out of the air through direct air capture using, let's say, MOFs or COFs, which are magnetic organic frameworks or covalent organic frameworks. Okay, so here's a little bit of an overview of how machine learning has already been starting to make impact in this field. And I'll go from the very small, which is, let's say, a molecule, and this is the electronic structure that you see around it, vibrating. It's described by this deceptively simple looking equation, which is called the time-dependent Schrödinger equation. And it's really extremely hard in general to solve it for general Hamiltonians. And so people have done a couple of things. Quantum variational Monte Carlo is one of them, where you have some kind of neural architecture to try to find the ground state. Fermi-net and Pauli-net are 2 recent machine learning advances that have sort of improved on that method. So these are now neural networks that predict the ground state energy. And then here's DFT, density functional theory. It's really the workhorse of all of this. And now people have sort of trained better functionals using machine learning in order to improve and accelerate DFT. That's on the quantum side. The molecular dynamics side, which is where we're interested in moving around the molecules through time. That's described typically by the Langevin equation. It's written here. The change in space, this position is given by its velocity. The change in velocity is given by a force, and then a friction term, which reduces the speed, and a collision term, which is a Brownian motion like field. And it's been a really big success recently, which is called force fields, which are now replacing this term, which again, you need to compute using DFT or other quantum methods. That's being replaced by a neural net. And it's like many orders of magnitude faster than doing the quantum mechanical calculation. And so now we can do MD simulations on a much larger scale. Going up in scale, yet again, we go to continuum methods. Here is a non-equilibrium method called the Navier-Stokes method. This is a partial differential equation that describes, let's say, the weather as it evolves. So people that predict the weather use this equation and a whole bunch of other ones, but this is the core equation. And recently there has been a huge revolution in this field where instead of trying to solve this equation numerically, people have built PDE surrogates, which is just a very large neural network that takes in the current state of the weather and maybe a few states in the past and try to predict the future states up to 10 days in advance. And what's happened is that meteorologists have gone from being very skeptical about this, you will never change a field that's 100 years old, to, okay, actually this works about as well as, what we do with numerical simulators, but 10,000 times faster, right? And so there's a bit of a panic reaction, like, okay, we really need to make sure we integrate this into our pipelines next to the numerical solvers. They won't go away, but it's at least part of the solution. And then finally, this is, I'll talk to a little bit more, depending on the appetite for this, is a little bit more technical. This is called DFT, classical DFT. So it's not the quantum DFT, but it's the classical DFT. That's trying to follow a classical fluid, the density of a classical fluid as it evolves. It evolves according to a Fokker-Planck equation, where this is the velocity term. And that's, again, accelerated with machine learning. I'll tell more about that later. And here's some application areas: drug discovery, fitting a drug into a pocket; catalysis, this is the surface of the catalyst, and these are the reactions that are happening place. In generative models, there's been 2 recent generative models in this space: Genome from Google and MetaGen from Microsoft, that are actually generating pretty decent new materials. And adding them to the database, they are stable and actual materials that could exist in the world. So the point I want to make, this field is moving very, very quickly. Every new, conference, lots of new methods are happening. Okay, so what makes that tick? Why is machine learning making this impact in this field? Okay, the first reason is that we've moved to a new paradigm where more simulations, more experiments, if you wish, happen in silico. So the old way of doing things, of course, you try to build, to make things in your test tube, and then you test them, and if they work, it's great. If they don't, you move on, you try something else. To, doing these experiments, but then collecting a lot of data and then training machine learning models or statistics models on that data and try to analyze it and come to new insights and try to figure out whether, what will be the next candidate to look at. To actually doing the actual simulation, the experiment in a computer using molecular dynamics experiments. So that's from experimentation to simulation. And the second step is amortization, which is from simulation to emulation. Now, what is emulation? So I show you this here in this sort of example. So I'm a car manufacturer, and I actually gave this talk at Mercedes, but it could obviously be any other car, whatever, right? But anyway, so you take this car, you have an initial design, you put it in your actual physical wind tunnel, or maybe in a digital wind tunnel, and you do your experiments and you figure out, oh, this is a great car, it has fantastic aerodynamic properties. But then next time you invent a new car and you want to go through the same process. Well, in the old paradigm, you would have to start over again, just do it again, right? And that's actually very expensive. So the new paradigm would be you store all the data of all the experiments and all the digital experiments you've ever done. you put them in a big database. You then train emulators, which are just neural networks, to try to predict what the outcome of this would be if you who would have done that. Of course, you need to know how reliable it is, which is not trivial, but people work on it. And so now you sort of either run your emulator at many orders of magnitude speed up, or if you decide the car is too different from what I've seen before, I need to go back to the simulation. But then if you do the simulation, you create new data that go back into the database, in which case you can also improve your emulator. So it's like a sort of, I don't know, circular economy of data, if you wish. Okay, so a little bit more about molecules. A molecule consists of atoms. Atoms are bound through different mechanisms. There's also a big electron cloud around it. There are different forces between the atoms, but there's also a very important component that's being mediated by the electron cloud. Now, molecular dynamics is nothing else as Newtonian dynamics, hundreds of year-old math. So you update the position according to velocity, you update the velocity according to a force. It's just the problem is that this force you need to compute using quantum mechanics, and that's where the problem is. And so now I'm going to say a few words about how to replace that with a force field. I won't go into a huge amount of detail, but I'll just introduce this graph neural net. Since a molecule is a graph, it makes a lot of sense to model it with a graph neural net, which means you put the atoms at these nodes, and in order to compute the force, you would go through a number of iterations of exchange of information between these neighbors in such a way that at the end of that computation, you can predict the forces on each one of these atoms. Or you predict the energy and you backpropagate one more time to get the forces. Now, graph neural networks are a bit different than normal CNNs, let's say, convolutional neural networks, in the sense that it's not regular grid, the number of neighbors can change, etc. And so there's a number of ways to go to circumvent that. Basically, you need sort of functions of these two states, and then you sort of aggregate through summation, for instance, all of these messages that you have to create on the edges, and then you update the node. Okay, so that's not quite it, because a molecule has a symmetry. It has actually many symmetries. Some of them are permutation symmetries. Some of them are actually rotation and translation symmetries. If I rotate my molecule, any property of that molecule, if the gravitational field isn't too strong, should actually be non-existent, right? So you want whatever you predict to be independent of orientation and location of your molecule. But a neural network doesn't understand that. And the reason it doesn't understand it is that if you rotate the molecule, you enter very different numbers, because the locations of the positions of the atoms are now given in very different numbers because you've rotated it. And so you need to make the neural network understand that really a rotated input is the same as the original input. And we are used to this, because if I change my head, right, I can sort of understand that if I go this way, then the world will move that way, and it's still the same world, even though the information that's hitting my senses is very different. Okay, so symmetry has played a huge role in physics. I think one of the most inspiring things I learned when I went through undergrad was, the unification of electric forces and magnetic forces through Lorentz transformation. So it's basically the spectral relativity applied to electromagnetism, which gives you this unification of these forces. It basically tells you can turn an electric field into a magnetic field by changing the frame of reference from one frame to a moving frame. Another example is basically the equivalence between gravity and acceleration, from that simple principle, basically all of general relativity can be built. And then, of course, there's also, the fundamental particles of the standard model, which are organized in groups. You can transform one particle into another particle by one of these SUN groups. And so that also builds structure into sort of the elementary particles of the standard model. Okay, so how are we going to build this equivariance into our neural networks? If you want to read more, I recommend this particular piece of work by Maurice Weiler. It's a 550-page Bible on, everything you ever wanted to know about equivariance and more. It's his thesis. And it is richly illustrated by these beautiful illustrations. And so the first chapters are very, high-level introduction with all these beautiful illustrations. And then as you need more math, you can dig deeper and deeper until you get to page 300. And, there's always, some place where you can give up because this gets too complicated now. And I congratulate you if you make it to the end. So what do you do if you want to make things equivariant? It's actually quite simple. You make sure that if you take an input image and you transform it, and then you filter it using a layer of your neural net, it should be the same as first filtering and then transforming the filtered image, whatever that transformation is. It doesn't have to be the same as that one, it could be a different one. If you close that diagram, then and you do this for every layer and for every non-linearity, then you're guaranteed that your neural network will understand that a transformed input is actually just the same input as the untransformed input, and we'll have to learn nothing new about it. Okay, so now we need to combine these two things. We need to combine graphs with equivariance. And so this is where equivariant graph neural networks come into play. The idea is, again, you have some graph with positions, there is vectors, which are velocities, and maybe some scalar properties like the type of atom or whatever. And then I'm going to say, if I rotate the graph, which is what happens here, and then I transform in my neural net, which of course changes everything, it should be the same as first transforming the graph neural net and then rotating it. Okay, so that needs to hold. If that holds, your graph neural network is actually equivariant.
Before I forget this, a lot of people use data augmentation
Yeah.
by taking images and rotating them in order to have more data they can train on. So doing this in a invariant way seems natural, but does it take away from that ability?
So I would say that is sort of the heuristic way of doing things. It's easier, but it doesn't do it mathematically correct, right? If you do that, it can still, it's not mathematically true. Let's say that something is completely invariant under rotations or certain transformations, where this one here, it is mathematically true. So I would say you can save yourself that work by building an equivariant neural net. Now, it is true that sometimes the transformations are hard. You don't have the representation theory, and you may not be able to build the structure into the network, and then you can revert back to something like data augmentation. Yeah. Okay, so here's then a force field. So it is again pictorially written, where you have nodes. On the nodes there are spherical harmonics, because those are the representations that are beautifully equivariant. And here, you see them change. These combinations of spherical harmonics as we go through the computations of the layers of the neural net. And of course, this guy understands that if you rotate the world, it will have absolutely no effect on it. So we published this paper called the SC3 transformers that was used in Baker's lab to do protein folding for Rosetta fold. Actually, some very similar architecture is also used in AlphaFold as well. Okay, so now on to generative AI. So we've done sort of now force fields, which are part of simulation, so part of the emulator acceleration, right? Simulation acceleration by emulators. So now we go to the generative part of the AI. And to come back to the theme of the tight interconnection between physics, in particular non-equilibrium, statistical mechanics, and machine learning, I just highlight the title of this important work, which says Deep Unsupervised Learning Using Non-Equilibrium Thermodynamics. Right? I guess there's a bunch of physicists on this page. I think Yasha and Surya certainly are physicists. And so they were very keenly aware that what they were building here is actually inspired on the non-equilibrium thermodynamics. So how does it work? You start with a particular data manifold. Of course, this is a very simple two-dimensional one. You should think of a million-dimensional manifold with the pixels of an image. And then we have a process, which is just the second law of thermodynamics, which says that everything will return to dust, right? All of us will at some point be subject to the second law of thermodynamics. It takes a lot of energy to stay structured and organized. But if you let things on their own, they will destroy information and it becomes a noisy blob. Now, what does the learning algorithm do? It says, let's try to learn to do this in reverse, right? We're gonna first have some process that destroys the information in this direction. And every little time step, I'm going to observe what happened, right? And I'm gonna try to learn a force or a vector, whatever, that undoes it, that tries to say, if I would sort of flip time around and go backward in time, what would I have to do? And that's going from here to here. So here you pick some random point and then you simulate and then you hit that point, which is a point on the manifold. Now that was a great paper, but it didn't work as well, maybe for, I don't know, maybe 6 more years as to make a really big impact. So in this paper, people mapped the problem onto a stochastic differential equation, which is basically Brownian motion with a drift term and a collision term, say a noise term. And then for that, you know what the inverse problem is. You just have to add this additional term. And that's called the score function. Of course, you don't know this because you don't know what PTX is, because that's your data distribution. But you can learn it, and you can put a neural network here and then learn what that function is to go backward in time. Another important advance is that they make the algorithm much better by showing how you can train these things, layer by layer. So you can just pick a random layer and do an update, pick another random layer, do an update, rather than having to back propagate through the whole structure every time you do an update. So that's a huge advance. And of course, it gave us, all these beautiful diffusion models that we have now. So we applied this idea of graph neural nets and actually equivariant graph neural nets to the generation of molecules. So we have a database of molecules. We define a diffusion process to get the blob of random atom types and random positions. And then we learn how to undo that, taking into account all the symmetries of the problem. And then you get this beautiful sort of denoising algorithm that generates molecules of the right type in the right positions and the right relative sort of configuration. And the whole thing is equivariant because the probability of generating this or a rotated variant are equal, mathematically equal. Okay, I'll go through a few more examples of this, of where, this is some of our own work, but many people have done fantastic work in this field. I'm just highlighting some of our own work. So this is conditional generation where we condition on the shape of a pocket of a protein, and then we are generating the small molecule that should fit into that pocket, iteratively using a conditional generative model. And so that looks like this. This is the movie of where you can see that happen. And it's even slightly better because you can put certain fragments in certain places and say, I want, that particular molecule to sit there in that piece of the pocket and another piece somewhere else. And then I'm just asking this model to complete the molecule. Now, this is early work, and some chemists have pointed out this doesn't look like a drug-like molecule, but I just want to say that every month this actually improves very fast, right? So models now are already a lot better than this. This is another fun project, which you call Sisyphus project. If you try to recall your Greek mythology, this was this poor guy, Sisyphus, who had to roll up the hill, a huge rock. And when he was up the hill, it will all roll down and he would start over again forever, right? So it wasn't a nice fate, but that's sort of the fate that a molecule has. So if you have a molecule and you're trying to get from one metastable state to another metastable state, this molecule wiggles and wiggles. And there have to be a whole bunch of wiggles of precisely the right shape to get over this energy bump to the other metastable state. And so if you want to do this in your computer, you'll be waiting forever. And so what we did with a chemist is to try to formulate this as a control problem. So we have already seen large event dynamics where we update position with velocity, update velocity with force plus noise. And now we add an additional term. So this force only lives in your computer. It doesn't live in the real world. But we're going to force the molecule using this extra force. So that green line there, we're going to force it to get over the hill to the other side in the other metastable state. Now, there's a reward for this system, so you do a whole bunch of these things. There's a reward that says if you reach the other side in these steps, you get a huge reward. But you should also use the least amount of work to do it so that you get over, you don't go here, but you sort of go over the saddle point. So that's, that's actually equivalent to a Schrödinger bridge problem if you're familiar with it. But a Schrödinger bridge problem in turn is equivalent to a reinforcement learning or control problem. Actually, this is called path integral control. That's the term the technique. So here you see the sort of in two-dimensional sort of configuration space, very simple molecule. Here we are forcing it from one metastable state into another metastable state. And this is like the free energy surface. Here's a low free energy, it needs to get there. And sort of it's figuring out its path as it goes. Here's a few more examples of that on bigger molecules. The method already works a lot better than what I show here. Anyway. Okay, so the last topic, so this is a little bit more technical. I just want to see where am I with time? How much more time do I have? Is there a clock somewhere here? Really? Okay, I'll just keep going until I hear something. So this is a project that we did where we got very excited about. And recently I talked to a chemist at UC Irvine who told me that this was actually much more exciting than I thought before. And the idea is that we are going to try to simulate a liquid. It's not a quantum problem, it's a statistical mechanics problem. And we're trying to find the equilibrium density of a liquid in some external potential. So you could think of some molecule like an MOF, and then there is a gas that flows through this MOF, and we want to understand how the gas molecules cluster around the molecules of the MOF and come up with the equilibrium density. Or we can also actually do dynamics, because once we have this free energy, okay, so first write down, so the objective is a variational free energy, it's called the grand potential function. It consists of a free energy, an internal free energy for the internal degrees of freedom, which models the sort of the gas only. And then there is an interaction term of the density for the gas with the external field, which is just, your other molecule or whatever, maybe a boundary of some kind. And then there is what's called a chemical potential, which controls the number of molecules in the system. Now, what we're going to do is, classically what happened is that physicists would down something for this term. So they write down some term for that f of rho. But that's an incredibly important thing, incredibly difficult thing to write down. So they come up with all sorts of approximations, by expansions and whatever. It never really works, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to write that as a neural net. We'll explain in a minute how. And we're going to just learn from MD simulations, molecular dynamic simulations, what that free energy term should look like in the shape of a neural net. Okay, and then once we have it, once we have this thing, actually this F, should be that F. Once we have it, we can then run also the time dynamics of the fluid, because that's again just the Fokker-Planck equation in the overdamped limit, where it's just a continuity equation where the velocity field is given by the FD rho, the gradient of the FD rho. Okay, so what are we going to try to do? We're going to start with an input distribution. This is the distribution of the MD simulation. We're going to push this through a neural net to predict the free energy. Then we do auto-diff to get the FD rho. Okay, that's good. Now we have the FD rho. We can, so that's our model, the FD rho. But there's also this equation which should hold, which is if we have the log rho, we can also compute the DFD rho like this in equilibrium. And then we look at the difference between the two, we put some norm around it, and we backpropagate such that in the end, the DFD rho from the model is equal to the DFD rho, but it should be. Okay, that's one method. The next method is actually much better, which is we again do a MD simulation to get the density. Then we compute the radial distribution function, which basically tells you the density for every point, pick a random point, and look at the density of the molecules as you go some radius r away. And of course, this is 0 because the molecule, the atom takes up some space, so there can be nothing else. But then once it's sort of, there's space again, the next atom will sit next to it and then the density will shoot up. Okay, so in this case, we start with a completely flat density. So V equals 0, there's no external field. We push it through a neural net, auto diff, again auto diff, and now we have df d rho I d rho j. The second derivative of df is respect to rho I and rho j for a bulk material without any external potential. So that we can now relate to the actual two-point correlation function, which you can compute for this GR, the radial distribution function. In fact, you can even measure this thing, but you can also compute it from MD simulations. And then we match them and we learn. Now, what's amazing about this, that we only train at V equals 0. So we just need liquids which are homogeneous. And then when you're all good and done for one of these methods, you can now run, let's say, this update equation, the iteration update equation, where you compute df d rho, and you take, this term, you take the exponent, and then you update rho, and you stick it back in, compute this again. This is a neural network now. You iterate through this process again until the whole thing equilibrates, right? You start with something, you go through f df d rho, you get df d rho, you stick it back to this equation, and you iterate until the density profile gets to equilibrium. And now you get to test it. We've done many tests. So here we have sort of a potential. And then here we see the Monte Carlo estimate, which is ground truth. And both the red and the blue models are machine learned models. And if you look at the best models that have been proposed, it says here mean field, but it's actually much more sophisticated than mean field. It's called fundamental measure theory. And we get these profiles and they just get it wrong. And you can go for very extreme potentials and it will still get it right, even though it's never seen any potential. It feels like magic, but it really works very well. And so what we have achieved here is much more accurate methods than previous methods. I think it's finally kind of useful. We can directly predict the free energy, which people couldn't do before. It's much more efficient in 3 dimensions because we just have to look at radial distribution functions, and it generalizes much better to nu V. Okay, I just wanted to give you a little bit. So this is sort of a little bit detail. So if you sort of phased out here, that's fine. But I just wanted to give you at least one example where there was a little bit more detail about what you can do with machine learning. From here on, it's possibly less strenuous. I do want to know the time, actually.
15 minutes.
50 minutes. All right, good. Right. Okay, so now I'm going to switch to something that's slightly different. It's still AI for science. In this case, we're going to try to improve our machine learning models using insights from neuroscience. Actually, it was sort of a little bit the other way around. We had our own ways. The reason why we wanted to think about this from symmetry reasons. And then we started to talk to sort of neuroscientists, actually somebody who's here very close, Terry Sanowski and Lyle Miller. And we started to work with them on, how this could be interesting also in neuroscience. Okay, so the idea is that, again, I'm just going to remind you what we thought equivariance was, right? So I have some input, and then I have some transformation on the world, which could be a symmetry transformation, but it could be actually any transformation. As out comes another image of the world. This could actually be the future state of the world, right? And then I have an encoder that encodes the world in my brain. Could be an artificial neural network, the latent states of an artificial neural network, but let's say this is the state of my brain. Then I have some evolution in my brain state to go to a new brain state. And then I want to predict the future, right? So this is what we all want to do. We want to all predict the future. So you can think of it, okay, I'm absorbing what I'm seeing. I'm closing my eyes. I'm thinking a little bit. I open my eyes and I predicted you would all still be here. And I was perfectly correct. So I will not have to update my model, right? But if some big change happened and I wouldn't have expected it, I would probably have to update my model parameters. So this is kind of a generalized way to think about equivariance. And so now, if we want to build more general models of, you know, equivariant or incorporating transformations, we need to think about what model we put in these latent spaces that transform one set of hidden activations to another set of hidden activations. So AKA thinking, right? How do I make this latent space think? And so after a lot of thinking, we came to the idea that this might be the right model. It was inspired by some other paper, which did something similar for graph neural net. We changed a few things, like we added convolutions here, but not too much. And then you can think of this model, instead of trying to read the equation, you can think of this model mostly as this. So this is one neuron. The neuron has a sort of an excited state, let's say, when it's high, and there's a depreciated state when it's low, but they're connected to their neighbors. And actually, it's sort of, they have some oscillatory relationship with each other. So, you know, if this one is up, you know, it will pull the other one up, but there's a little time delay. Okay, so that's kind of the model. And then what happens if you train all the parameters in this PDE, this is a partial differential equation. If you train all the parameters of this thing, what will happen is that you will see that in order to predict the future, the model will start to create waves. Of course, it's reasonable because things need to be local. And of course, we sort of encourage this oscillatory behavior as well. And it starts to create waves. And so here's an example of how that relates to equivariance. So here is sort of the symmetry transformation. And then I want that if I first do a symmetry transformation and then encode, it should be the same as first encoding and then do the symmetry transformation in the latent space. Of course, this is a rotation of the object. Now that's a very different transformation. It's a bunch of waves that move around, but I'm training it so that this diagram gets closed. And what does this model do very well? I don't think I have time to go over a whole lot of results. I will just show some illustrated results. What this doing is very good is hold things in memory. So you can give it tasks where, actually we built an RNN model for this. You can give it tasks where you sort of ask it to look at a whole bunch of symbols that come across, and then if a particular symbol comes across, it then needs to remember that the next symbol, and then a whole bunch of new symbols come. So the trigger symbol comes, the next symbol you pick up, and then you add the two symbols, and you wait for a long time, and then you produce the answer, the sum. So many RNNs just fail horribly at this because they can't keep that information in memory. And somehow these waves keep these things beautifully in memory. Okay, so we went on with Huey and Andy to also think about, you know, maybe a better way to build disentangled representations or a definition of disentangled representations. There were already some proposals of how to look at disentanglement through transformations. So here we think of it as we have some input image, we encode it, so we get a latent state Z for this particular input image. But then we also produce a bunch of velocity vectors V. V is a gradient of some potential. Later we generalize that. It's a velocity field that we also generate when we encode. And then we know how to transform. So we can constantly, you know, create a new state, we move it to the next state, we compute a new velocity vector, and we can now start to transform this particular latent state. And then if you would decode, you would see something that maybe changed color, and then it would actually rotate, and then it would scale or something like this. And so we now propose that basically a good way to make a representation, to build a representation, is by the actual, you know, the encoding plus these velocity fields in which you can transform the image. So the most natural way in which you can transform this image in terms of its symmetry transformations. Now we extended this. This is a recent submission where we not only have gradient velocities but also rotational fields. So you get some vortices that are also going around. Actually, these are also seen and measured in the brain. We have a velocity field, so you can transform with different velocities, which is also a function of time. And the goal is to extract from general data in an unsupervised way, you know, what is the basis or the elementary transformation fields, right? So not it's like independent transformation analysis where you want to get out a basis for a sparse basis for the transformations that you can apply to an input. And then you get things like this, right? Where one of these fields would give you rotations, One of these fields will give you scalings, and one of these fields will give you color changes. The way it will automatically extract that from the data set. And then you can also start to play around and change and have combined things. So you can sort of first, let's say, change color and then scale, right? Or you can first rotate and then start to change color. So you can basically combine these transformations, these symmetry transformations. Or you can do linear combinations, which means that you can both rotate and scale, or rotate and change color, right? And so the algebra is a very nice additive algebra in this latent space. We also tried it on general images. We'll also get some independent decomposition in transformations, but I think we still need a bit more work on that to make it really convincing. Okay. So back to this is the last few slides. I think there is an amazing opportunity in AI for science. So we've named the ages in which we live after the materials that we use. I've heard we now live in the Plasticine, which is basically the plastic age. So the idea is that in maybe a few decades, we can live in a time when we can generate materials on demand. And I'll explain in a minute, how we can reach that state, that vision. I first want to say that, this is a very opportune time because the computational science is, including supercomputing, machine learning, and in the future quantum computing, are starting to have a huge impact on the molecular sciences. And more importantly, perhaps even, is that the application areas in sustainability, energy, and health are only going to grow more important, right? As we are heating up our climate, there will be increasingly important to go through the energy transition and even maybe start pulling carbon out of the air. And how are we going to achieve that? Well, we need to solve this problem, in my opinion, which is the inverse design problem, which is you give me a prompt, a novel NOS structure with a surface area of blah, 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 with a whole bunch of things that you want. And there's going to be a search engine in the background that will deliver for you a bunch of candidates which should have those properties. And you can sort of, you can see how they could work. You can first generate something with your generative model. Then there is a reinforcement learning agent that manages resources and that says, okay, let's test whatever you proposed using my emulator. It's still uncertain, but maybe it passes the test. Then we escalate to the simulator. And that it might fail here, and you go through a few of these candidates, and then the reinforcement learning agent will have to come back and say, okay, well, actually, we didn't do so well. I'm going to propose a new bunch of new candidates, maybe through local moves, or maybe I'll just go back to the generator and tell it what we have learned here, and guide the process to better molecules or materials to generate. And we iterate through this process until, we get something that's good enough for an experiment, and then we push it to the experiment. And then when all that is done, you deliver the material to your chemist, who will then test it maybe herself. So to conclude, I think there's deep connections between AI and natural sciences. I think it runs deeper than most people think. In fact, I think it's almost identical. In some sense, both machine learning and physics is about information. So there's many physicists now who think that physics could be completely derived from information, from bits. And of course, machine learning and data science is also about bits and information. So there's very deep connections. Machine learning is the new tool, I feel, for sciences, and this will only become more important, but I think machine learning can also learn from the methods that have been developed in the sciences, like, symmetries and non-equilibrium thermodynamics. And then finally, I think, and the most exciting and most important reason to work on this is that there is fantastic applications in health and sustainability. I think those are more inspirational than improving ads. Here, actually, you could design new drugs and new materials that are very helpful to solve some of the hardest problems that society faces. And I hope I didn't go too much over time, but that's where I will end and open the floor for questions.
Questions?
Thank you for being with us, Professor. I want to start with one technical question about the wave-like model, the work that you did on, on modeling like the latent space transformations using second order PDE. I was wondering if you simply added you simply added the predicted results to like the first order gradient and the variable itself, or did you use any kind of PDE solvers to assess?
No, I think we did a very simple, we just did a very, actually, not even a leapfrog integration. We just did a very simple Euler integration. So no solver, just, and actually that's fine because the learning process can compensate. Right, so the learning process can compensate, but it might be much better if you would actually be a little bit more serious about the numerical solver for the PD. But I haven't tested that. It already worked well, so. But yeah, yes, yeah, that could be good.
One second question is, since you said earlier you talked about the design loop of maybe you simulate with some different car design, earlier car design,
Yeah.
and then you use that data to perhaps predict the result of a new design.
Yes.
So I was wondering if it's possible for us to derive any new insights for like designing new cars from that process. In addition, because I understand that deep neural networks are good at predicting those, but then will we still be able to extract anything, any knowledge about how to better design new cars, or do we consider that would you consider it unnecessary now, given that we have these great predictions?
I think it's a great question. I think definitely from those simulators, you can also extract knowledge, I guess. So one thing is you could try to look at that emulator and see what it does. So try to visualize what it's doing in order to make these predictions. Or you could do something like symbolic regression, where you would try to extract simple rules about what it's doing. And from that, you can probably gain insight. But that just tells you something about, I guess if it's an excellent car, it will tell you, how it scores on some of these metrics that you might extract. And then you might think, okay, that's interesting. We might want to use that again in the design of the next car. So I think I've spoken to many scientists who, all of them invariably tell me, okay, now you've solved this problem, but how am I going to use it? Because you've just trained a black box and I'm not learning anything from it. And so you can have two ways to view this. If you're an engineer, right, or you want to predict the stock market, right? If you want to just build a material and can just check how good the material is, fine, right? Maybe you don't care about how you got there. If you want to predict the stock market, then I give you a fantastic stock market predictor and you're making a ton of money, you're not going to not use it because you don't know precisely what's going on in there as long as cash keeps flowing, right? And so there's just different attitudes that you can have, right? One attitude is an engineering attitude, which is I need to achieve something and I'm achieving this with this tool. The other attitude is I want to learn something so that in the future I can build more and better tools. And there you will need to do extra work to inspect what this neural network is thinking. Yeah.
Yes. In the original one, you're talking about the molecular dynamics. You talk about I think unequal barren graphene network, right? I remember previously in that N3, it's E3 equivalent neural network. They're talking about how to construct the graph from the regional molecular systems. I think that's I think the method they use is they just connect the neighboring atoms with a certain radius.
Yes.
But I think isn't that missing? It's a gap from the actual molecular system, right? But in the real molecular system, you have this kind of distribution, the fields like with very complicated influence between each atoms. Do you think there's a better way for us to build this structure?
Excellent question. So there's no reason at all why the graph for the graph neural network should be a one-to-one map to the graph of There is one reason why you might think it's reasonable at least to look at a neighborhood, because you would think that the molecules or the atoms which are close interact strongest.
Yeah.
And so that makes sense to have direct links there. Of course, if you go through multiple layers, also information from further away will reach the node. Right? Now, there is certain effects which are very non-local, like especially when you have
Yeah, like conjugated system.
if you have electrons which are not bound to a particular atom, then they will just really floating in some metals that happen. Then this is not going to work because it's not going to. So but then you can start. Okay, maybe I should then change something and maybe create a global node, and everybody suggests the global node and redistribute. So it's a matter of them taking care of that. But the fact that I sort of glossed over here's a graph and here's a molecule and they're sort of the same. You're absolutely right. You need to do some thinking.
Yeah, I mean, in general, like the real world system has a gap between the data we represent, and there's another gap, which is how we use machine learning to learn from the data. So we talk a lot about the gap, how to close the gap to make our machine learning to better learn the data we have. The data have some problems like equivariance. But do you think there's some effort we should put on how to build a more intuitive data structure to represent the real world?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
This is very interesting. One thing that I see here is that we're trusting differential equations, even as being a very good description of how physical world works. And those were built by, as you said earlier, by scientists. We're actually doing experiments with real data. And now it seems that we have a situation where believe the equations and we just do experiments in silico. But are we missing something by just trusting the equations for what they are and ignoring the outside?
Okay, so we trust the equations in because sometimes we ask them to generate data, and so that can happen on different levels of accuracy. And when you do quantum mechanics, you're not actually looking at a PDE node. So you trust quantum mechanics or you don't, I guess. But I think when you get to more coarse-grained levels, certainly a PDE is an approximation because you get memory effects, because you're averaging over things. And those memory effects are clearly not taken into account in a PDE. But the neural network surrogates actually do not assume a PDE, because how does a neural network for predicting the weather work? You take a whole history of previous states, and all of those states get mapped into, let's say, a state in the future. And so it doesn't assume, Markovian dynamics at all. And with neural networks, actually, you can go much more general. You can be completely non-local. You can be completely non-local in time and space, basically. And since there are correlations, it will exploit that to predict the future. Yep.
Thanks for the very nice talk. So I have a question. So you have shown some excellent result about generating this model structure. So but the thing is that after we generate those, it's impossible to visualize all the chemical bond. So based on my understanding of this field, usually what they do is that they put them under some kind of light with certain frequency, and then they look at the fluorescence spectrum to determine actually what the structure of the generated material. So basically what we can kind of observe from an experiment is this kind of a fluorescence spectrum of the separate peaks. So I'm just wondering, what do you think would be a good way to kind of bridge a gap between something that you actually generated or you synthesized to the actual experimental data that we can measure within the lab? Because I think this process contains some unexpected feature. For example, when you synthesize your sample, maybe you dope in some unexpected impurity, which could affect the actual data you get from this the light shining system. So what would be some of the good ways to model this process? So we start from the design to the actual data we collect from our device.
Well, that's going beyond my expertise, I think, because I don't know how chemists do their experiments. I do think that when you generate something with a generative model, you first need to do a few more steps of DFT, MD in order to get it to settle to an actual ground state. So you're pretty sure that whatever you have, even in your computer, is an actually stable material. But let's say you've done that. To then So there's one question, how do you incorporate data back into your model to improve your model? There's different ways. I think you can do that. In fact, it turns out that the radial distribution function is measurable, so that's something that you could actually incorporate. But to deal with impurities in the material and comparing that with the actual thing you generated in your computer, which is presumably clean, that's actually beyond my expertise, I think. I don't think I can give you an answer. You have to ask an actual experimenter, I think. Something.
Yes, I want to push a little further your analogy between entropy in physics and entropy in information, which I think is very interesting. Does that analogy two questions? Does it help explain why entropy increases on the one hand?
Yeah.
And does entropy increase as information entropy increase? Because actually we're trying to decrease it. I think why there's something used that according to this Jane's point of view, the more we learn about the data, we can specify it and learn more details, and entropy actually decreases.
Decreases, yeah, but of course at the expense of other entropy, which will increase. So it's a very complicated story and it's beautiful to read into. But what's really happening is that the only real reason that entropy is increasing is that the state that you're in now, or that the universe was in when it started, is a very low entropy state. And then if you take that and you start coarse graining, you just go to new variables, which are the variables that we understand our world in, like X falling on the ground, right? In terms of those coarse grained variables and the fact that the world started in a very low entropy state in those variables, you will derive that the probability is almost infinite that the entropy must increase. But there are fluctuations. There's even fluctuation theorems which tell you that on very short timescales, entropy can actually come down and go up again. So the whole thing fluctuates. The theory is very well developed, but it's completely consistent with the idea that the only reason entropy exists in our equations is because when we measure something, we stick a very large measurement device into our solution, and it interacts on an extended amount of time and on an extended sort of surface with this thing. And so you're averaging whatever you're measuring over a lot of interactions with the state of the unit, one state of the universe with that thing. And that creates actually the reason for distributions. And once you have distributions, you can go to entropies. It's beautiful to read about. I really encourage you, and you can start with E.T. Jaynes, but then there's a whole bunch of other discussions. It was a huge discussion, I think, in the 19th century between Boltzmann and Gibbs. And people didn't figure this out for the longest time. And it's a whole philosophical debate that was going on for many years. And it's a lot of fun to read about it, I think.
Can I ask a little bit of a question to wrap up?
Yeah.
You see value in gauging sort of credibility or certainty of those model outputs, as opposed to just increasing the accuracy, testing it aggressively.
Absolutely, 100%. I think when we really want to use these things, and we really need to kind of have some kind of reliable sense of uncertainty, right? Because imagine that you're trying to do an ND simulation with your force field, and the force field runs out of its sort of domain where it's trained, it starts to do weird things, and you can't rely anymore. But if you have something where you have an expensive simulator and you have a cheap simulator, and when you can detect when you're running out of bounds with your cheap simulator, you can backtrack with the expensive one and then one expensive one. So you can build robust simulators out of a combination. But you do need uncertainty or confidence intervals. So that's going to be a hugely important part of this.
Thank you very much.